Section. The Case of the Silent Hours. It was on a fog-bound Thursday morning in late November of 1893 that the curious affair of the silent clocks first drew Holmes' attention. The mists had draped Baker Street in a dense, pale veil, and the gas lamps flickered like watchful eyes squinting through the damp chill. Inside our sitting room, a fire had been coaxed to life, and Holmes sat languidly in his armchair, his slippered feet crossed before the hearth, a battered monograph on horological anomalies lying across his knees. I, meanwhile, had just returned from my morning rounds, my medical bag still damp with drizzle. My patient list had offered little to stir the spirit: 2 cases of catarrh, 1 of chilblains, and a stubborn chesty cough in an elderly seamstress, whose flat was so cold I had lent her my scarf. Dull work this time of year, I muttered, settling into my chair across from Holmes. I should welcome a murder, just to quicken the blood. Holmes did not look up. That may be arranged, Watson, though I should prefer something subtler. You know my distaste for gratuitous bloodshed. Then perhaps a theft or a vanishing. Better. Still, he said, and finally closed his book. For example, a theft so gentle it leaves no broken lock. A vanishing so slow the victim does not even realize they have disappeared. I raised an eyebrow. A philosophical puzzle, or do you speak of a real case? Holmes leaned forward, steepling his long fingers. An hour ago, a note arrived hand-delivered by a footman in the livery of Sir Almeric Phelps, the banker, of Kensington? The same. A man of reputation, rigid routine, and I believe an undercurrent of desperation. Holmes passed me the note, written on thick cream stock in a hand, so precise it might have been traced with a ruler. It read, "Mr. Holmes, I request your immediate attention to a matter both bizarre and inexplicable. Over the past fortnight, 5 clocks within my household have ceased to function, each on a different night, each precisely at 2:17 in the morning. They are of varied make and manufacture, maintained regularly and stored in different rooms. Yet none were damaged, and none resumed functioning, despite fresh winding or repair. I might dismiss this as coincidence, were it not for the fact that my daughter, Miss Violet Phelps, has awoken at exactly 2:17 on each of those nights, claiming to have heard footsteps in the corridor, though no one was there. I am not a man given to superstition, but I am also not a man who disregards the improbable when it begins to repeat with alarming precision. Please come at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Sir Almeric Phelps." I lowered the note slowly. An oddity, certainly. But surely this is a matter for a clockmaker. "A dozen have already been consulted," Holmes said, rising now, and reaching for his overcoat. "None can offer an explanation beyond mechanical coincidence. And yet 5 clocks, each stopping on a different night at the same minute, paired with reports of phantom footsteps. That, Watson, is no trick of worn gears. You believe it to be deliberate?" "I believe," Holmes said, already fastening his scarf, "that something has been carefully orchestrated to resemble the improbable. When the improbable repeats itself, it ceases to be coincidence and becomes, instead, intent." Within the hour, we were rattling westward in a hired brougham, the fog thick enough to mute even the clatter of the city. Kensington lay draped in gray silence, and the Phelps residence, an imposing Georgian townhouse on the edge of Palace, green loomed out of the mist like a ship adrift. Sir Almeric greeted us in the front vestibule. He was a thin man with angular features and eyes that scanned with the perpetual suspicion of a man used to guarding vaults. His manner was crisp, almost military, and yet there was a tension in his movements that betrayed deeper disquiet. "I trust you received my letter," he said, ushering us into a high-ceilinged drawing room lined with books and brass sconces. "This business with the clocks, frankly, Mr. Holmes, I would not have involved you if it were merely a mechanical failure. But my daughter has been quite unnerved, and I cannot dismiss what she has heard. Has there been any sign of entry?" Holmes asked, examining the room with swift, practiced eyes. "None. Doors locked. Windows sealed. We even hired a night watchman for a week, but he heard nothing unusual." Holmes's gaze settled briefly on a long-case grandfather clock against the wall. "That one?" Sir Almeric nodded. "It stopped 3 nights ago, again, at exactly 2:17 a.m. And before that, the mantel clock in the music room. Then a French carriage clock in my wife's study. The oldest was a marine chronometer kept in my own chambers. Each of them simply ceased, no sound, no winding failure, just ... Silence. Holmes turned to me. "Time, Watson, is often our most overlooked witness." He then asked to see Miss Violet Phelps. She entered the drawing room a few minutes later, a young woman of perhaps 25, with a calm face and unusually alert gray eyes. She wore her hair tied back in a style more practical than fashionable, and though she greeted us with grace, it was clear the events of the past weeks had strained her. "I've never been one for dreams," she said, once seated. "But on each of those nights I awoke with a start, as if something had disturbed me. I sat up, certain I had heard movement in the corridor. Not hurried steps, just slow, steady pacing. But when I got up and checked, there was no one there. No. Sights? Smells? Any sound besides the steps?" She paused. "Once I thought I smelled something faint like tobacco. A particular kind, sweet. Not your father's?" "No, he's never smoked in the house." Holmes gave her a small nod, then turned to Sir Almeric. "Might I see the household ledger? I presume a residence like this has some record of service staff and contractors." Sir Almeric seemed briefly puzzled, but complied, retrieving a thick red book from his studied dot as Holmes pored over the entries. I wandered to the grandfather clock. It had not been rewound. The hands still sat frozen at 2:17. Holmes made no comment until we were back in the cab. "Well," I asked, "do you suspect tampering?" "Not yet, but I do suspect design. Did you notice the pattern in the clocks?" "They were in different rooms." "Yes, but each was also situated near a chimney flue." "Meaning?" "Meaning someone clever is exploiting the infrastructure of the house to move or act unseen. Chimneys are more than vertical shafts. They connect with other service ducts. And if one were nimble enough, even slim enough..." "You think someone's entering the rooms through the flues?" "Not entering, observing. Or perhaps leaving something behind." He fell into thought, then added, "We shall return tonight, Watson. I have a theory, and if I am right, the 12th stroke of 2 shall bring it to light." And with that, Holmes closed his eyes as the cab continued through the fog, and I knew that another midnight mystery had begun. Section. Footsteps in the chimney. The fog had only thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street that evening curling like smoke through the gaslight and trailing across the cobblestones in ghostly tendrils. Holmes stood by the fire with his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp silhouette cut against the flickering hearth. I had long since learned that such postures were harbingers of deep concentration, and I dared not interrupt until he chose to speak. "The peculiarities, Watson," he said at last, "are layered. Not merely mechanical, nor atmospheric, nor even psychological. What we have is a convergence, a series of clues that, taken individually, seem mundane, but when examined together, reveal intent." I looked up from my notes. "You mean the clocks, the footsteps, the scent of tobacco?" "Precisely. 5 clocks, each stopped on a different night. No sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, and a daughter who awakens at the same hour, troubled by unseen pacing." I frowned. It could still be coincidence, could it? Clocks in different rooms of different types, all halting at exactly 17 minutes past 2? "There's only one plausible conclusion. Someone wishes to draw attention to that hour." He turned to face me now, his eyes bright beneath furrowed brows. "And consider this. If a criminal intended to oust without detection, would they not avoid leaving traces? Yet here we have traces of a different sort. Clocks stopped, footsteps heard, a scent lingering in the air. This is not stealth, Watson. It is a performance." I could not help but shiver, despite the warmth of the fire. What sort of villain performs such a strange ritual? One who wishes to unsettle. Holmes replied, "To create disquiet, to draw focus away from what is truly being done." We dined quickly, Holmes barely touching his food. He spent the hour after in focused silence, rummaging through his collection of maps and architectural folios until he retrieved a faded blueprint. "The Phelps house," he said, laying it across the table. "Observe the chimney system. It connects every room in the upper floors. More than that, it intersects with an old service flue once used for dumbwaiters." He pointed to a dotted shaft that ran adjacent to the main chimneys. "It's been bricked up in places, but in a house of that age, gaps are inevitable." I studied the plan. "You believe someone is using these ducts to access the house?" "Not access," Holmes said again. "Observe. Perhaps to place something, or remove something very small. But the clocks? A flourish, Watson, or a distraction." That night we returned to Kensington with the permission of Sir Almeric, who had consented, though with evident reluctance, to let us stay in the house under the guise of late-night consultation. Miss Violet, too, had agreed to retire early and not alert the servants. The grand halls of the Phelps residence took on a different character by lamplight. The thick carpets and paneled walls seemed to absorb every sound, and even our footsteps were muffled as we crept along the corridors. Holmes carried a small pouch of tools, while I brought only my revolver .4. Habit than expectation. At 1:45, we stationed ourselves in the drawing room, seated in the shadows. The grandfather clock loomed across from us, its pendulum swaying steadily in the hush. We waited. Minutes passed. Exactly 2:17. The clock gave a soft whir and stopped. Holmes moved instantly, silent as a shadow. He crossed the floor, reached inside the clock casing, and retrieved something tiny, barely visible. "A thin sliver of metal," he whispered, "inserted into the mechanism to interrupt the escapement wheel, placed by someone with intimate knowledge of clockwork." Just then, from the corridor beyond the drawing room, we heard the faintest sound. A footstep. Not hurried, but measured. Then another. And another. Holmes extinguished the lamp. We stood in darkness. The steps paused outside the door, then retreated softly, deliberately. Holmes's hand gripped my arm, steadying me. "Now," he mouthed, and motioned me forward. We exited into the corridor just in time to see the flick of shadow vanish around the bend toward the servants' stairwell. Holmes followed silently, every movement controlled. Down the stairwell we crept, to the basement where the old dumbwaiter's shaft had once terminated. It was barely more than a hollow cavity now, with a rusted iron grate set into the wall. Holmes knelt. "There," he whispered. "The mortar here freshly disturbed. Someone has cleared a space." He reached into the shadows and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a journal, leather-bound, worn, its pages filled with tightly inked lines. Holmes read a few entries by lamplight, his brows rising. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "this explains a great deal, and yet raises even more questions." I looked over his shoulder. The handwriting was sharp, elegant. The entries were dated back over 20 years. "It's not Sir Almeric's," I said, double quotes. "No, it is the hand of a woman, and if I am correct, one long thought dead." He tucked the journal beneath his coat. "We must retire now. There is someone I wish to visit in the morning, someone who was once a guest of the Phelps family, and who may know why the past refuses to sleep." As we emerged back into the night, the fog had lifted, revealing a sliver of moon overhead. Holmes looked up at it for a long moment, then turned to me with that rare, grim smile I had come to know. "The clocks were merely the chimes of memory, Watson," he said, "but I fear they are heralding a secret that was never meant to be." Unearthed. Section. The woman in mourning. The following morning dawned cold and gray, with a thin veil of mist still clinging to the cobbles as Holmes and I made our way across the city. Though the gas lamps flickered wanly behind us, Holmes moved at a brisk pace through the damp streets of Kensington. The journal we had recovered from the dumbwaiter flue tucked securely beneath his arm. We arrived at a modest but well-kept residence, nestled just off Captain Hill Road. A maid with flushed cheeks answered our knock, and, at the mention of Holmes's name, led us without hesitation to a drawing-room lit by a small fire and the faint sunlight that managed to filter through the heavy curtains. There, seated in a high-backed chair and draped in widow's black, was a woman of perhaps 60. Her hair, though streaked with silver, was still arranged with elegance. She looked up as we entered, her eyes sharp, expectant. "Mr. Holmes," she said, rising with composed grace, "I've been waiting some time to see you." "You are Mrs. Genevieve DeWitt?" Holmes asked. "I am," she said. "Or I was. These days I prefer simply Genevieve. Widowhood grants one certain liberties." Holmes offered a short bow. "You were once acquainted with the Phelps family." "I was," she said, gesturing for us to sit. "In another life. Before Rupert's death, and before Almeric took it upon himself to reinvent his household with a more palatable collection of guests." Her tone was not bitter, but matter-of-fact. She poured tea into fine porcelain cups, her every motion precise and without tremor. Watson cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe that you might know something of the events unfolding at the Phelps house." specifically incidents involving the clock's strange nocturnal disturbances, and if I may speak plainly, a hidden journal we found bearing. Your hand." Her cup halted midway to her lips. She set it down gently. "So you found it," she said, not with surprise, but a wearied acceptance. "I often wondered when someone would. I placed it there 23 years ago." Holmes leaned forward. "You hid it deliberately?" "I did," she said. "There were things that could not be spoken aloud. Rupert, my husband, was a man of science, of secrets. He worked closely with Sir Almeric in the early days when they were both young and brimming with ambition. But ambition curdles Mr. Holmes, and Rupert's brilliance became inconvenient." "Convenient? For whom?" Holmes asked. "For Almeric," she replied. "And for a man named Captain Aldridge." At that name, Holmes's brow twitched ever so slightly. "The same Aldridge who was later disgraced during the West African scandals." "The very one," she said. "He was a frequent guest at the house. He and Almeric always in discussion about metallurgy, transport, even clockwork design. But something changed after 1878. Rupert withdrew. He no longer trusted them. He said there was something buried beneath the estate, something tied to a project they called the Midnight Compass." Watson blinked. "I beg your pardon? A name only," she said. But it chilled him. He feared what it would be used for. And then, one night, he fell from the West Tower balcony. Broke his neck. They said it was an accident, but I never believed that. Holmes sat back, fingers steepled. "So the journal, your account, was hidden as insurance?" "Yes, but I never dared retrieve it. After Rupert's death, I was politely dismissed from their circle. They married Almeric off to a cousin of some baronet. The rest was history rewritten to exclude my husband entirely." "And Miss Violet?" Watson asked. "She would have been only a child." "She was never told the truth," Genevieve said, "and I never saw her again." Holmes stood slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. DeWitt. You've helped far more than you know." As we stepped back into the street, the fog had thinned, but a chill still hung in the air. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "Pieces of a much larger puzzle," Holmes said. "If we accept Mrs. DeWitt's testimony, and I do, we now have a motive long buried, a scientific project that led to a suspicious death, a man with powerful friends silencing his partner, and now, decades later, someone is recreating a ghost story with stopped clocks and unseen footsteps. The question is, why now?" As we made our way through Knightsbridge toward our next destination, Holmes suddenly stopped short. He turned to me with eyes alight. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the western chimney at the Phelps house?" "Yes. You said it intersected with the sealed flue." "Correct. And do you recall the rusted grate in the basement?" "I do," Holmes nodded. "We are returning to Kensington immediately. I believe someone left us a message there, a warning, or perhaps a final clue." That afternoon, under cover of dusk, we once again descended into the belly of the Phelps estate. Holmes brought a lantern and a chisel, and he made short work of the old mortar around the basement great dot. After several minutes of careful excavation, he produced something from within, a small tarnished pocket watch, its glass cracked, its hands frozen at 2:17. Holmes opened it. Inside, etched on the inner lid, were the initials R.D. and beneath it, a phrase in Latin, tempus non curat veritatem. Time does not conceal the truth, Holmes translated. He closed the watch and looked up at me, his expression darkening. Rupert DeWitt's final word, perhaps, but to whom was it meant? We returned to Baker Street that evening with more questions than answers. Holmes laid out the watch, the journal, and the sliver of metal from the clock on the table. He stared at them for a long time, then lit his pipe. "Someone wants us to uncover this," he murmured, "not stop us. They want the past exhumed." I opened my notebook. And what will we find when we dig deeper? Holmes looked into the smoke curling above the hearth, his eyes thoughtful. Something that was meant to remain buried. But as always, Watson, the past is patient. It waits, and now it knocks. Section. The dust in the timepiece that evening. The fog lay thick as meringue across Baker Street. The street lamps glowed like lost stars caught in gauze, and the occasional clip of horse hooves echoed in damp rhythm through the gaslit haze. Inside our sitting room, Holmes stood as still as the marble bust on the mantel, staring at the trio of objects laid before him, the shattered pocket watch bearing Rupert DeWitt's initials, the copper sliver from the parlor clock's movement, and the aged journal from the dumbwaiter flu. I sat in my usual chair, notebook on knee, glancing occasionally between Holmes and the hearth, where our fire hissed as though bothered by the weight of secrets. "Holmes," I said at last, "you've been silent for 20 minutes. What precisely is formulating in that mind of yours?" He gestured to the pocket watch. "Time, Watson. Time and silence. Consider it. 8 clocks in the Phelps house, none ticking, yet none broken. A man falls from a tower to his death decades ago, and a watch frozen at 2:17 is hidden in a bricked-up flue for years. Why?" "I can see the symbolism," I offered, "as if someone wanted time to stop at the moment of a crime." "I can see the symbolism," I offered, "as if someone wanted time to stop at the moment of a crime." "Quite," Holmes said with a flick of his fingers, "but it's not mere symbolism. No, someone is communicating using silence itself as a language, and we must learn to listen." He turned back to the table and delicately extracted the copper shard, turning it beneath the lamplight. His eyes narrowed. "Watson, you recall the laughing pattern on this piece?" "Yes. You said it had been filed post-manufacture." And? So it has. But look here along the inner edge. This discoloration just here, copper oxide with traces of graphite, which means," Holmes set it down, "it means that someone tampered with the inner gear assembly recently, within the last month, I'd wager. This shard didn't break through age, Watson. It broke because someone overwound the system using a lever they knew would snap under pressure. The silence of the clock was not accidental, it was engineered." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a silver tray and a kettle. "I brought your tea, Mr. Holmes. You've not eaten since breakfast." "Much obliged, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said absently. "Tell me, did we receive anything by post today?" "Only this," she said, handing him a small envelope of heavy parchment. "No return address, arrived by private courier." Holmes examined the envelope, his brow knitting. He opened it delicately and withdrew a square of thick card, upon which was written in spidery hand, "Time is neither enemy nor ally. It is simply the stage." Beneath the line, a single initial. V. Holmes did not speak for a long moment. Then, folding the card, He placed it beside the pocket watch and stepped back. "Our composer is playing with metaphor now," he said, "which means the next movement is imminent." He turned to me abruptly. "Watson, do you recall Violet? Phelps's mention of the attic room, the music room?" "Yes, she said she hadn't entered it since her father's death." "Precisely. And if my suspicions are correct, that room is not as abandoned as it seems. We go tonight." We arrived at the Phelps residence shortly past 9 o'clock, under cover of mist and shadow. Violet answered the door herself, still dressed in mourning black, her expression caught between worry and resignation. "You've found something," she said without prompting. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "We must examine the attic, if you please." She led us up the narrow stairwell to the topmost floor, where the corridor narrowed and slanted under the eaves. A single wooden door stood at the end, its frame dusted with cobwebs. "I haven't been inside in nearly 10 years, Violet said, drawing a key from her pocket. "I kept it locked after Father's accident. It was always his domain." The lock clicked. The door creaked open. We entered a room saturated with silence. A piano stood at one end, its keys covered with a lace cloth. A violin lay on a shelf, untouched. Along the far wall, beneath the gabled window, stood a long case clock, its face smeared with dust, its pendulum still. Holmes moved to it immediately. "This is not the same make as the others downstairs," he muttered. "Older. And look here, Watson, your lantern." I approached. He illuminated the clock face, then crouched to inspect the housing beneath. "There's a false panel here," he whispered. "Give me your penknife." With surgical precision, he pried at a narrow seam along the mahogany casing. With a soft click, a panel opened, revealing a hollow interior. Inside was a bundle of documents, blueprints, schematics, and a faded photograph. Holmes withdrew them carefully. The photograph depicted 3 men standing beside a large machine of intricate gears and brass housing. One was unmistakably a younger Sir Almeric Phelps. Another, I presumed, was Rupert DeWitt. The third man's face was mostly turned away, but even so, I felt an odd jolt of familiarity. "Aldridge?" I guessed. Holmes examined the blueprints. "It's a design for something called the chronostatic engine," he said. "Dated 1877. He turned to Violet. "Miss Phelps, have you ever heard of such a device?" She shook her head. "Never. My father spoke often of Rupert, of experiments, but never of that." Holmes rifled through the rest of the documents. "Look here, correspondence, letters from DeWitt to your father. Most are mundane, but this one." He held up a note dated just 3 days before DeWitt's death. "Almeric, I fear our partnership has reached its end. The chronostatic engine is not a toy, nor a curiosity. If Aldridge insists on proceeding, I will go to the press. We cannot play with time, even metaphorically. You may silence clocks, but you cannot silence conscience." R. Holmes folded the note and looked at Violet gravely. "Your father was involved in something more than theoretical tinkering. DeWitt threatened to expose him and then fell to his death days later. Make of that what you will." Violet's face paled. She looked to the clock, then back to Holmes. "What do you believe happened?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that someone, perhaps your father, perhaps another, sought to bury a terrible mistake. But mistakes, like timepieces, leave mechanisms behind." He turned to me. "Come, Watson." We must find the one man who might still know the truth, Aldrich. As we exited the attic, Holmes paused once more at the long case clock. He reached in and gently nudged the pendulum. It swung once, twice, and stopped again. Time has stood still long enough, he murmured. We descended the stairs in silence, the creak of the old floorboards underfoot the only sound. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, swallowing the streetlights. But Holmes's stride was purposeful as we vanished into the gloom. "The gears are moving again," he said, "and I fear we're not the only ones winding the mechanism." Section: The Horologist of Holloway. The following morning, a brittle winter chill lay heavy across London, as if the city itself shivered at the memory of crimes past. Holmes and I made our way to Holloway Row, a narrow street, where industrious workshops spilled their warmth into dank alleys, and the distant wail of factory sirens mingled with the clang of metal. The lamps on the lampposts were doused by dawn's pale light, yet the world seemed colder for it, each brick in shadow. Despite the chill, Holmes walked with a purposeful stride, his coat flaring behind him like a dark cloud. He held the tarnished pocket watch bearing Rupert DeWitt's initials against his chest, as though drawing its secrets into himself. Our mission interviewing Josiah Aldrich, the horologist whose memory stretched back to the scandalous invention of the chronostatic engine, loomed ahead of us with the weight of generations. I glanced from Holmes to the crowded storefronts, haberdashers, glass-blowers, and at last a modest shop distinguished by a small brass sign that read, "Josiah Aldrich Horologist and Scientific Machinist." The first shop I had seen where everything glowed with purposeful quiet. We stepped inside. Clocks ranging from elegant mantelpieces to brass automata lined every shelf, each ticking with deliberate precision. Gears spun quietly like living mechanical hearts. The aroma of cedar oil mingled with the ozone tang of metalwork. Holmes's entrance seemed to rustle something in the shadows, and I sensed the inevitable convergence of past and present. Aldrich emerged from a curtained doorway. Tall, austere, silver-haired, not elderly, but shaped by trials beyond mere years. He peered at us with cool intelligence through steel-framed spectacles. His scrutiny, as rigid as a clock spring, held us captive for a long moment. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice low but unyielding, "you do not knock. I do not keep office hours for idle inquiries." Holmes stepped forward, removing his hat and offering a crisp nod. "Mr. Aldrich, I apologize for the intrusion, but we come regarding a matter of grave importance. The mysterious deaths and peculiar occurrences at the Phelps estate, and matters concerning a device you once helped develop in 1877, the chronostatic engine." At that, Aldrich's stern posture wavered. His grip on the door tightened, then loosened. "Come in," he said abruptly, a voice measured but tense. The shop door closed behind us, leaving only the tick of 1,000 clocks in its wake. Holmes moved further into the alcove and removed a small notebook and steel pen from his coat, his ritual of focus. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We believe you retain records, details, insights into the engine's purpose." Aldrich led us to a workshop at the back. A foot-high bench supported wrenches, files, and nearly finished timepieces. On a rack hung tools described in a dozen languages, each designed to coax secrets from metal. Behind it, on the wall, was the photograph of the chronostatic trio, Almeric Phelps, Rupert DeWitt, and Aldrich himself, beneath the half-constructed engine. I feared it would be seen. Aldridge said quietly, voice rough with remembered grief. It was meant to be buried along with the evidence of what we tried to do. Holmes tapped the glass that protected the photograph. What was the objective of that device? Aldridge rubbed his temples. To create what we called temporal resonance, a short-lived illusion of time dilation. But our experiments went too far. DeWitt withdrew when he discovered one of the test subjects, an Army private, became catatonic. Later, he threatened exposure. Holmes leaned forward. Your notes say the mechanism used a series of pulsed crystalline diaphragms around a small gyroscopic lens. A clockwork amplifier triggered changes in cerebral circulation. Aldridge's eyes widened. You've studied the schematics? Holmes placed the blueprints on the bench for Aldridge to inspect. Yes. Then he tapped the pocket watch, and we discovered this DeWitt's watch, broken but found in a sealed flue beneath the chimney stack. Someone wanted time to freeze at the moment DeWitt died. Holmes lit his pipe and stood with his back to the fire. DeWitt, I believe, was the visionary. He imagined a world in which time could be perceived differently, stretched, condensed, or paused, depending on the state of the human mind. Phelps, in contrast, was the craftsman. He built the devices. It was their collaboration that yielded the engine hidden beneath the tower floor. The chronostatic engine, I murmured, still studying the journal. Grayson mentioned the term. Indeed, Holmes replied, a rather dramatic name for what amounted to an elaborate experiment in perceptual manipulation. It did not move one through time, but rather disrupted the internal sense of its passage, amplifying or stalling moments through auditory and visual interference. He took a seat across from me and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I suspect, he continued, that DeWitt's initial goals were theoretical, but when he involved Grayson, already mourning the loss of his wife, the project took a darker turn. It was no longer about discovery. It became about recovery, about trying to relive that which was lost. I set the journal down, struck by the implications. But why build such a machine in secrecy? Why entomb it in the tower? Holmes gestured toward the stack of journals, because it worked at least partially. But the effect was unstable. Phelps recorded hallucinations, memory gaps, even altered states of emotion. DeWitt claimed to have seen his dead brother standing in his study. On more than one occasion, Grayson wrote that he could hear Eleanor's voice in the ticking of the clocks. He handed me another page, this one loose and heavily creased. It bore a single, jagged line of writing. What begins with seconds may end in eternity. I must choose. I felt a chill. Grayson? I asked. Holmes nodded. The night DeWitt died, the machine had been activated. But something went wrong. The watch we recovered from the estate silver engraved was not merely decorative. It was the activation key, a tuning fork disguised as a pocket timepiece, designed to emit a specific vibration that triggered the device. Grayson removed it after DeWitt collapsed, then destroyed part of the mechanism. But he never could bring himself to dispose of the crystal, the one hidden beneath the chimney, I recalled. Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully. Precisely. But here's the pivotal detail. It wasn't Grayson who buried the crystal. He confessed as much. Someone else feared its influence enough to conceal it permanently. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, extracting a small bound notebook. "That someone was Mrs. Anstruther, the housekeeper?" I said, surprised. She never struck me as particularly scientifically inclined. Holmes smiled faintly. She wasn't, but she was loyal. She had served the DeWitts and Phelps families for over 3 decades. She witnessed their descent into obsession and knew the danger far better than anyone else. When she found the crystal hidden in Grayson's study, she took it upon herself to hide it forever, not to preserve. Aldrich scoffed softly. "Time cannot be broken, no matter how elaborate the machinery, but it can be perceived differently, temporarily." Rupert, misguided as he may have been, was right. "Your father, excuse me, Phelps crossed a boundary, and someone paid for it." "You believe Phelps had something to do with DeWitt's death?" Holmes sat back. "It seems likely." Aldrich paced, his mind racing. "He silenced him, maybe not directly, but certainly he orchestrated events. The fall, the clock stopping at 2:17. He plucked a travel clock from the bench. I made these to immortalize his time, an apology, maybe, but hope that what followed would be disciplined, benign, only as honest pieces." He wound it gently, and the clock began to tick. Holmes moved to a wall covered with ticking devices. "What of the new clock incidents? The stoppages, footsteps, tobacco scent in Kensington? You think someone is replaying history?" Aldrich asked quietly. Holmes paused beside an ornate regulator, listening. "I fear a vengeful mind, or a mind out of step with time itself, is replaying tragedy for reasons still unclear." I placed a gentle hand on Aldrich's arm. "You must help us. These antics are not harmless. They threaten to unbalance someone's sanity." He closed his eyes and exhaled. "I will help. But first, I want you to see the hidden archive." He led us to a narrow door behind a tarp of ticking clocks. It opened onto a stairwell descending to a subterranean vault. Illuminated by oil lamp, the vault held sealed crates, dusty journals, scientific artifacts, testimony to research and regret. Aldrich selected a wooden crate and pried it open. Inside lay mechanical parts, leaf springs, vacuum lenses, copper, coils shutting dust. Holmes extracted a slender crystal lens. "This," he said, "seems intact, the core of the engine." Aldrich nodded, pale with memory. "I salvaged it, after Rupert. I hoped to recreate the effect, but to correct it. Create beneficial perception shifts, but I never dared." Holmes studied the lens under the lamp's glow. A dangerous artifact indeed. He folded the parchment journals next to it. "We must learn who is using this now." Aldrich swallowed hard. "I fear I know who." Holmes glanced up sharply. "Grayson, the groundskeeper," Aldrich said. "He worked here after Rupert's death, quiet but loyal. He had access to everything. He dug tunnels, cleaned equipment. Then ... he vanished without trace." Holmes nodded. "Watson mentioned him." Aldrich continued. "I dismissed him, feared he might discover too much. He left that night of DeWitt's funeral." Holmes stood quietly. "And now someone, or Grayson himself, is reviving these mechanics." The horologist glanced at us. "Tonight, the ground beneath the silent tower awaits." Holmes placed his hand on the crystal. "We will go tonight, with your permission." Aldrich bowed his head. "It's the first time I've seen that device in 30 years. Holmes smiled thinly. Time to end this performance once and for all. Section. The Man in the Tower. Twilight cast long indigo shadows over Kensington as we returned to the Phelps estate, our cab rattling along cobbled streets slick with frost. Holmes had remained silent for most of the journey, the crystalline lens cradled in his gloved hand like a talisman of revelation. From time to time he would hold it up to the light of a nearby lamp post, studying its prismatic glint with the detached reverence of a scholar handling sacred relics. "Watson," he murmured at last, "do you believe that guilt can ripple through time? That one man's error left unatoned might persist, not just in the hearts of men, but in the very walls and instruments they once touched?" "I'm a doctor, Holmes," I replied, watching the quiet streets roll past the window. "I've seen wounds left to fester, but those wounds exist in the body, not in time itself." He gave a tight smile. "And yet this affair has the scent of something festering beyond the bounds of mere flesh. We are dealing with a ghost, Watson. Whether of the living or the dead remains to be seen." When we arrived, the estate appeared deserted, the household having retreated early. A single light burned in the tower, faint and flickering, like a lighthouse turned inward. The hour was just past 10. Holmes moved with deliberate care, the watch and crystal lens concealed within his coat. I carried a revolver at his insistence, though I loathed the necessity. The air smelled of iron and pine wood, faintly mechanical. Ascended the stone stairs to the main hall, where Mrs. Anstruther had once discovered the odd smudges of soot. A strange hush clung to the house, not merely quiet, but evacuated of breath itself. It was Holmes who broke the silence as we passed beneath the balustrade. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, pointing to the grandfather clock. "The minute. Hand is missing." I looked. The face of the great timepiece was marred, its hands were bent backward, warped unnaturally as if exposed to intense heat or pressure. On the floor below, where its pendulum once swung in regal rhythm, a neat pile of soot now lay curious and symmetrical, like the residue of burnt offerings. Holmes crouched to inspect it, drawing a pinch of the gray-black powder into a sample. "Pouch. The chimney has not been used in weeks," he murmured. "And yet this is fresh. Burnt oil and brass, something artificial." I stared upward, my attention drawn to the faintest of sounds above us. A click, then another, then silence again. "The tower," Holmes said, rising swiftly. "He's returned." Returned? We moved carefully, avoiding every creak in the floorboards. As we reached the landing, Holmes raised a hand, motioning me to halt. He pressed his ear to the door at the top of the tower stairs, then slowly turned the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside. The tower was dimly lit by an oil lamp, its glow thrown against walls lined with schematics, clocks, and tattered photographs. In the center of the room, positioned beneath a sloped ceiling window, stood a table on which an elaborate contraption had been reassembled, wires snaked across copper coils. Gears turned slowly within a brass casing, and at its heart glimmered a faceted crystal, an exact match to the one Holmes now possessed. But it was the man behind the table who drew our full attention. He was tall, spare of frame, clad in a caretaker's faded overcoat. His hair, once dark, had grayed unevenly, and his eyes shimmered with an unfocused intensity that verged on mania. He had not heard us enter. Instead, he hummed softly to himself, adjusting a dial with trembling fingers. "Mr. Grayson, I presume," Holmes said quietly. The man froze, his shoulders tensing, but he did not turn. "Do not approach," he said. "She's almost ready. The engine must not be disturbed. You'll undo it all." "I think it's time we did precisely that," Holmes replied. Grayson turned at last. His eyes were a startling blue, piercing, but frayed at the edges as though stretched too thin across the years. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "They silenced DeWitt. They pretended it never happened. But I saw it. I heard what they did to time." "You were there the night Rupert DeWitt died," Holmes stated. "You saw it, didn't you?" Grayson's mouth twitched. He begged them to shut it down. Aldridge tried. But Phelps wouldn't. He wanted to control it. "Perception is power," he said. "So I took the watch, his timekeeper, and I ran. I buried it beneath the chimney where they never thought to look. And now you've returned," I said. "To what? Rebuild it?" "Not rebuild, restore," he rasped. "I can reverse it, Watson. I can turn the dial and rewind the moment. I'll bring back DeWitt. Undo the harm. Just a few more calibrations." Holmes stepped forward. "You're not restoring anything. You're haunting this house, recreating the very conditions that led to tragedy. Mrs. Phelps is terrified. Clocks stopping, footsteps echoing. This is your theater of guilt, not salvation." Grayson's hands shook. "You don't understand. Time is not fixed. If I can just align the harmonics." Suddenly the contraption emitted a shrill whining note. The crystal at its center flared with eerie, strobing light. Holmes acted instantly. In one motion, he flung the matching crystal lens, our safeguard, into the device's housing. Sparks erupted. The whine became a scream of mechanical protest. The lights in the tower flickered. Grayson cried out. "No! You fooled the device!" Collapsed inward, its gears locking violently. Smoke issued from its seams. Then all was still. Grayson slumped to the floor, sobbing into his sleeve. Holmes moved to disable what remained of the machine, severing the power coils with a blade. I knelt beside Grayson, checking his pulse. He was dazed but unharmed. "It's over," I said softly. Holmes looked down at the remnants of the chronostatic engine. "The past cannot be undone," he murmured, "but we may still prevent it from destroying the present." As dawn broke over Kensington, we led Grayson out in silence. The house was still. The clocks, those that remained intact, resumed their ticking, cautious and reverent, as though time itself had sighed in relief. Section. The watchmakers. Signature, expanded edition. It was just past 10:30 when we returned to Baker Street. Outside, a sallow winter sun pushed through a blanket of fog, scattering pale shafts of light across the rain-specked window panes. The familiar comfort of our lodgings felt jarringly at odds with the weight of what we had uncovered at the Grayson estate. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent on the cab ride home, his brow knit in thought, eyes staring out at the blur of handsome wheels and wet cobblestones. Upon arrival, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a mixture of concern and restraint, noting our weary countenances and the mud caked to our boots. "Shall I bring up some tea, Mr. Holmes?" she offered gently. Holmes nodded. "If she has resurfaced, it will be under a new persona, perhaps a sculptor, a patron, a curator of dreams." "And what of the chronostatic engine?" I asked. Does it still exist? I believe, Holmes said, that we are not finished hearing its voice. It was never about timekeeping. It was about illusion. And illusion, he added gravely, is a most dangerous device when held in steady hands. He turned to me then with that unmistakable gleam that meant the hunt was on. Tomorrow, Watson, he said, we visit the Phantom's final stage. And with that, the fire crackled anew behind him, echoing the growing storm outside Dot Section, the House of Echoes. The next morning dawned cold and reluctant, with a wind that swept down Baker Street like a whisper from a graveyard. Holmes was already dressed and pacing before the hearth by the time I emerged from my room, his overcoat folded over one arm, his face sharpened with anticipation. Watson, he said briskly, the game nears its end. Today we find her. I offered a quiet nod, suppressing the unease that had lingered since Holmes had traced Seraphine Halloran to her newest lair, a converted chapel on the southern fringe of Highgate Cemetery, now inhabited by artists and visionaries, many of whom Holmes surmised were unknowingly tethered to her web. We arrived shortly past 10, after a cab ride steeped in fog and silence. The chapel stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the moor, its Gothic spire weathered by time, ivy crawling over its side like green fingers attempting to reclaim stone. The original cruciform windows had been boarded or replaced with colored panes of stained glass that filtered the light within into eerie hues. A discreet brass plaque read, "The Vesper House, a sanctuary for creative minds." Holmes knocked with a knuckle, so precise it sounded more like a code than an invitation. A moment later, the door creaked open to reveal a tall, rail-thin man in a velvet coat and paint-smudged gloves. His eyes were sunken but shrewd. "May I help you?" Holmes stepped forward. "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've heard your sanctuary hosts artists of singular vision. Might we look around?" The man hesitated, then opened the door fully. "If you're here to interview or patronize, very well. I'm Ellis, curator of the house. Our residents are reclusive, but we encourage inquiry." We entered. The air inside was thick with turpentine, wax, and burnt incense. What had once been pews were now studios divided by hanging canvases and velvet partitions. Sculptures jutted from alcoves like broken memories. Strange ticking came from somewhere deep in the building, softer than a clock, more like a heartbeat. Holmes moved slowly, his gaze sliding over every corner, every easel, every smear of color, with surgical precision. "Tell me, Mr. Ellis," he asked softly, "do any of your residents go by the name Miss Holbein? Or perhaps Seraphine Halloran?" Alice's mouth twitched. "No one by either name resides here, Mr. Holmes. We do not pry into our artists' pasts. Many come here to escape their former lives." Holmes tilted his head. "Then perhaps you might point us toward one whose work tends toward the ... temporal?" Ellis considered this, then said, "The East Transept houses our installation artists. You may find something there to your liking." Holmes and I passed through a low-arched hallway. The old chapel walls now hung with threads of fabric and hanging glass mobiles that twisted with unseen motion. In the far corner, behind a velvet curtain, we found it. The room was dimly lit by skylight, and at its center stood a strange contraption, not dissimilar to DeWitt's chronostatic engine, though stripped of brass plating and wires. This version was bare, skeletal, and entirely silent. Around it, Thick velvet ropes formed a symbolic spiral. Scattered across the walls were sketches, clock faces with reversed numerals, silhouettes caught mid-movement, strange spirals inscribed. In charcoal, Holmes walked slowly around the structure, not touching it. "She's been here," he murmured. I felt a chill. "But is she here now?" A rustle drew our attention. From the shadows stepped a woman, neither young nor old, wrapped in a shawl of midnight blue. Her hair was streaked with silver, and though time had changed her, the likeness to the old photographs was unmistakable. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I thought you might find me." Holmes did not flinch. "Miss Halloran." She smiled. Faintly. "I go by many names now, but yes." I felt my fists clench. "You left a trail of madness and death in your wake." She raised a hand. "You seek villains, I seek understanding. Where others feared delusion, I saw insight." Holmes stepped closer. "You used people, Seraphine. You broke minds with your theories, drove Compton mad, contributed to DeWitt's ruin, and nearly destroyed poor Mr. Grayson." "Grayson misused the theory," she said sharply. "He turned it into exhibition. I offered revelation temporal expansion, the unfurling of layered perception." "And what of time?" Holmes asked. "The clocks? The silence? The ticking that never was?" Seraphine gazed at the machine. "Time, Mr. Holmes, his memory dressed in rhythm. I wished only to show people how to see beyond the linear. We are prisoners to ticking. What if we listened to silence instead?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then you admit to constructing this second machine?" "I refined it," she said. "Remove the spectacle. Now it serves art, not illusion." "But people are disappearing again," I said. "Clocks are failing. Witnesses report visions. You are at the center." Her expression did not change. "The clock failures are echoes, residual interference. No harm was intended." Holmes took a step closer. "Your presence in this place distorts perception, whether you intend it or not. Miss Halloran, you are destabilizing reality for those around you." There was silence. Then Seraphine said, "Then you must decide whether to stop me or let the world choose what kind of time it prefers." At that moment, Ellis returned, unaware of the confrontation unfolding within the curtained chamber. Holmes turned toward him. "Mr. Ellis, I suggest you speak with Scotland Yard about an individual residing here under false credentials. This woman has deceived many, and though she may speak of art, her past is paved with casualties." Ellis paled, but to his credit, nodded. Seraphine stood still, like a statue caught in half-turn. "They'll never understand, no," Holmes said. "But the truth does not require understanding, only acknowledgement." As we stepped out into the wind again, I looked back once. She was still standing by the machine, shadow cast long across the stone floor, like the hand of a clock forever frozen. Holmes did not speak until we reached the cab. "She is dangerous not because she lies, Watson," he said, "but because she believes." "And now?" I asked. "Now," he said, lighting a cigarette, "we ensure she does no more harm." Section. The trap beneath time. The next 2 days passed under a thick and somber fog that seemed to dim even the gas lamps of Baker Street. Holmes remained largely silent during that time, his violin untouched, his pipe forgotten on the mantel. He sat for long hours in the bow-backed armchair, staring into the fire as if time itself had curled and folded inward. I refrained from interrupting him, save for meals and the occasional suggestion that rest might offer him greater clarity. On the evening of the third day, as the hands of the clock struck 6:30, Holmes stirred at last. "I've set the trap," he said simply, as if no interval had passed. "Tomorrow evening, Watson, we return to the Vesper House. Miss Halloran shall find herself caught in her own spiral." I looked up from my notes, in which I had been attempting to reconstruct the timeline of events for my own comprehension. "You believe she will be arrested?" "No, Watson. Arrest would be premature and possibly futile. The Yard lacks the tools, and I dare say the courage, to prosecute her based on metaphysical theory. No, we shall expose her with her own words, her own performance." Holmes stood, brushed a fleck of ash from his sleeve, and crossed to the writing desk, where a folded sheet of parchment lay sealed with a crimson stamp. "This invitation has been circulated under the guise of a public performance, a final demonstration of her machine in honor of a fictitious benefactor. She cannot resist. Her ego is as much a component of her design as any gear or wire. You intend to draw her into confessing? Not in so many words. But her audience will include one Miss Marianne Grayson, elder sister of the afflicted Frederick, and the very judge who declined a rule in Halloran's favor 2 years past. Both have been subtly encouraged to attend. I trust their presence will provoke ... revelation." He allowed himself a rare, cold smile. "I've also arranged for Tobias Lestrade and 3 of his plainclothes men to be present, disguised as critics and patrons of the arts. Should matters turn volatile, we shall not be without recourse." I could not help but voice the question that had troubled me since our visit to the chapel. Holmes. "Do you truly believe she intends harm, or is she merely mad?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to the fire, clasping his hands behind his back. "There exists, Watson, a line between genius and madness so fine that even its own creator cannot see where one ends and the other begins. Miss Halloran walks that line. If she stumbles to either side, the cost may not be borne by her alone. That night I found sleep elusive, haunted by dreams of ticking silence, dark velvet curtains, and strange contraptions pulsing with invisible currents. The following evening, under a slate sky swollen with mist, Holmes and I arrived once more. At the Vesper House, a curious crowd was already gathering painters in absurd hats, scholars with ink-stained fingers, poets with opium sunken. Holmes nodded absently. Yes, to hear the last confession of a man who lived more in memory than in the present. It was shortly after 9 when we arrived at Clerkenwell Prison. The interior of the structure retained a chill that no hearth could banish, the kind that made one's bones ache in sympathy with the silence of its inmates. The corridors smelled of damp stone and forgotten paper, and the gaslight flickered dimly, as though shivering with unease. We were ushered to a narrow interview chamber flanked by iron bars. Behind them sat Nathaniel Grayson. He had changed markedly in the short time since our visit to his estate. His once immaculate beard was unkempt, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness or remorse. He did not rise when we entered, merely nodded, his wrists resting on the table before him, loosely manacled. "Mr. Holmes," he rasped, "Dr. Watson, I thank you for coming. Holmes inclined his head. "You said you had a name for us." Grayson hesitated, his gaze drifting to the shadows beyond the barred window. "Yes, but first I must explain the nature of my final regret. You see, the woman in the photograph, her face gone, was not my Eleanor, nor was it torn away by my hand. I found it like that, deliberately mutilated. It was done to conceal her identity." I leaned forward. "Then who was she?" Grayson looked directly at Holmes. "Her name was Seraphine Halloran." Holmes stiffened visibly. "Halloran?" he repeated, his voice low. "Of course. You know the name?" I asked, glancing between them. Holmes's eyes remained fixed on Grayson. "I know the history. Seraphine Halloran was a protégé of Rupert DeWitt, a woman of extraordinary intellect, equal to his in many respects. She disappeared in 1885 after a scandal involving experimental methods at St. Augustine's Sanatorium. Her work centered on perceptual psychology and sensory suggestion, precisely the sort of theory that would complement DeWitt's mechanical ambition. She was more than a colleague," Grayson said quietly. "She was the architect of the illusion." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the stones themselves were listening. "Seraphine believed memory could be weaponized, that by manipulating what one saw or heard at a critical emotional juncture, you could reshape a person's beliefs, even their sense of identity. She called it temporal overlay, the imposition of false memory onto the framework of real time. She claimed the brain couldn't distinguish between a memory and a present event if properly stimulated." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Holmes's fingers flexed slightly. "And she used a chronostatic engine to that end." Grayson nodded. "She convinced Rupert and Phelps to build it. But her intentions, they were never pure. She sought control, not understanding. She used the machine not to restore, but to confuse. She planted voices, phantoms, in the minds of those who listened. I believe DeWitt discovered this only too late." "What happened to her?" I asked. "She fled," Grayson replied. "After DeWitt's collapse, she vanished from the estate. I searched for her in vain. The photograph you found was the last I had of her, taken in secret by Phelps. He believed she had crossed a line no man or woman should. He feared her even more than he feared failure." Holmes paced slowly. "So we arrive at a hypothesis. Seraphine Halloran used the machine to create false hauntings, visions, voices, distortions of time and place. And yet it seems she vanished without harvesting the results of her grand experiment." "I think she knew it had gone too far," said Grayson. "Or perhaps she feared what she had created. The truth is, I don't know. But I believe she lives somewhere, watching." Holmes turned to the barred window, then back to Grayson. "The watch? Why did you keep it?" Grayson's face crumpled into something between sorrow and defiance. "Because it still held her signature, her frequency. That sound, ... it brought her voice back to me. Even if it was only a trick of the ear." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Holmes nodded slowly, then stepped forward and laid a folded sheet of paper on the table. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. You have helped complete a puzzle too long left unsolved." Grayson's voice was barely a whisper as he asked, "Will you find her?" Holmes's eyes glittered, not unkindly. "If she wishes to remain hidden, she may. But she left traces, and those, Mr. Grayson, are my specialty." We departed Clerkenwell in thoughtful silence, the echo of the prison's iron gate closing behind us like the toll of a great, mournful clock back at Baker Street. Holmes spent the remainder of the day immersed in papers and correspondences. He sent word to Lestrade, to the Royal Society Archives, and to 3 asylums that once employed Dr. Seraphine Halloran under her maiden name before she became a ghost in the records. At dusk, he finally emerged from his study and stood by the window, pipe in hand. She was the phantom, he said softly, not of Candlelight Inn, but of all who passed through its halls. I turned from my notes. And you believe she still exists? He gave the faintest of smiles. Somewhere in London, a woman walks with the knowledge of how to make others doubt their senses. That is a dangerous gift, and a compelling reason to keep her watched. He turned back to the street below. Time does not tick for all of us, Watson, he said. For some it echoes. Section. Echoes through the labyrinth. A grey fog hung over the rooftops of London, blurring the edges of chimneys and casting lamp-lit halos along Baker Street. Inside 221B, the morning fire crackled low, casting ruddy flickers across Holmes' profile as he hunched over a spread of asylum ledgers, census records, and aged newspaper clippings. A pot of tea had long grown cold beside him. I found him thus at 8:30, seated motionless save for the flick of his eyes as they danced between lines of text. "You've not touched your tea," I remarked, pouring myself a fresh cup. Holmes didn't look up. The flavor is irrelevant, Watson, when one's senses are drenched in dust and ink. I raised a brow but said nothing further. We had returned from Clerkenwell only the previous evening, and the revelation of Seraphine Halloran's role in the mystery had ignited a renewed and razor-sharp intensity in my friend. Since Grayson's confession, Holmes had been following faint paper trails, narrowing the invisible corridors through which Miss Halloran had vanished more than a decade ago. Finally, Holmes straightened, holding up a delicate envelope with the sort of triumphant restraint only he could muster. "A name, Watson, or at least a new mask she may have worn." I leaned forward. "You found her?" "I've found where she might be. Seraphine Halloran, having vanished from her professional posts, appears under a new name, Miss Clara Haldane, listed as a private companion to Lady Arabella Compton in Belgravia from 1890 to 1895. That's 5 years," I said, whistling low. "What happened after?" Holmes tapped the paper. Lady Compton was declared mad. Institutionalist. Her estate sold off in parcels and her servants dismissed. Under sealed settlement. No record remains of Miss Haldane after that point. I sat back slowly. "You believe Seraphine caused Lady Compton's condition?" Holmes gave a tight nod. "If Seraphine employed her so-called temporal overlay theory in earnest, suggesting realities that did not exist, it is entirely possible she could distort another's mind so profoundly as to dislodge it from fact altogether. We must tread carefully, Watson. We are dealing not merely with a criminal, but a manipulator of perception." He rose abruptly, reached for his coat and gloves, and gestured toward the door. "We're going to Belgravia." We arrived at the Compton estate, a house once stately, now slowly surrendering to time's indifferent hands. Ivy climbed the chipped stone facade, and the wrought-iron gate creaked mournfully as Holmes pushed it open. A caretaker answered. Our knock, a bony man in his 60s with a salt and pepper beard and wary eyes. "No one's lived here in years," he said, clutching his key ring. "Lady Compton passed in the asylum 3 years ago. Family abroad now, some in India. I just keep the house clean, what's left of it." Holmes flashed his identification and spoke in tones too swift and confident for the man to refuse. We were granted entry, and soon we stepped into a grand foyer, the once gilded trim now dulled, the chandeliers darkened with dust. It was the parlor that caught Holmes' interest first. He walked slowly to the fireplace, crouched, and examined. "The hearth, burnt paper," he murmured, "and a faint trail of copper oxide. Watson, do you see the outline on this floor?" I looked, squinting past the motes of dust. "A small carpet, perhaps, recently removed? Or something covered for years and only lately disturbed," Holmes said. We moved from room to room, Holmes with his usual energy, I following behind, notebook in hand. In the upstairs study, he paused before a bookcase, scanning titles with rapid precision. One volume, a thin, leather-bound medical text, seemed to interest him more than the others. He slid it free, opened it, and shook loose a folded page. Tucked into the inner spine dot, it was a letter. "Dear's a letter. Dear them's persist, though the patients cannot name them." One woman spoke of clocks that beat in reverse, tick-tack, tick-tack, until her dreams ran backward. I fear I am not merely observing the phenomena anymore. I am inside it. C. Holmes handed it to me silently. "She never stopped," I murmured, "even after the machine failed." "She didn't fail, Watson," Holmes said softly. "She evolved." A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Holmes turned sharply. Eyes narrowed. We stepped out, but the corridor was empty. Only the long stretch of carpeting and a dim mirror at the far end offered company. "Caretaker gone," Holmes said. "Or someone else walking too lightly." We searched the remaining rooms. I, for my part, occupied the desk where I had just finished composing a letter to Inspector Lestrade. The matter of Seraphine Halloran was now in the hands of the Home Office. While no charges were likely to be pressed, no explicit crime could be found in conjuring illusions from science. There remained unease, not only among the authorities, but within my own heart. "You never told me," I said at last, breaking the silence, "what truly happened inside the Vesper house. That man in the chair, he was her father, wasn't he?" Holmes stirred. He reached for his pipe, not to light it, but to turn it slowly between his fingers. "Not her father," he replied, "but her twin brother, Elias Halloran, an engineer of some repute, presumed lost at sea 2 years ago in the sinking of the Elmbrook." I blinked. But why would she construct such a complex delusion of him? Surely grief can drive the mind, but to attempt to rebuild a memory into living reality? "She did not intend to create a phantom," Holmes said. "She intended to retrieve a truth." He rose and crossed to the sideboard, drawing from a folder a faded sepia photograph. It showed 2 children, perhaps 10 years of age, standing beside a clockwork automaton, likely one of their father's inventions. The boy's eyes, even in still image, possessed a kind of depth that mirrored the man we had seen briefly through the illusion of the resonator. She was convinced her brother had not died, Holmes continued. Convinced not by delusion, but by a letter she received anonymous, unsigned, bearing the words, "The mind remembers what the world forgets. Seek the resonance." I frowned. A cruel trick. Perhaps, or perhaps it was an echo of Elias himself, if he had survived, if he had indeed reached out from whatever exile or derangement claimed him. But you don't believe that? No, Holmes's voice was firm. The evidence points clearly to the power of suggestion. The machine, while scientifically remarkable, operated upon human perception, on rhythm, light, harmonic frequency. It induced hallucinations not by inserting images into the mind, but by manipulating the emotions that summoned them. I recalled the room shifting, the smell of lavender, the vision of the man speaking to her, as though no time had passed. The sensation of reality fray at its edges. Holmes saw the memory crossing my face and said, "Even you saw him, and yet you knew it was impossible." "Because you doubted it," I admitted, "and in your doubt I found clarity." "That is the curse of certainty," Holmes murmured. "It anchors the mind." He stood silently for a moment, then reached into the folds of his dressing gown and withdrew a curious object, something I had not seen him examine before. A small brass gear, no larger than a coin, engraved with 3 concentric circles, each with a unique pattern of notches. He handed it to me. "This was found in the base of the resonator," he said. I believe it was a failsafe, a limit placed by Halloran herself. The machine could only generate what the mind permitted. She never allowed herself to imagine Elias beyond that moment seated in the chair, smiling, so it could not progress. "In essence," I said, weighing the gear in my hand, "her own grief protected her." "Precisely." He turned back toward the fire, and I saw the moment of reflection pass through his posture, a narrowing of the eyes, a stillness that always preceded one of his odd philosophical musings. "Watson," he said, "do you remember the case of the Abbey Grange?" "Of course. There a crime was obscured by love. Here a truth was obscured by longing. It seems to me that we are often more frightened of the absence of someone than their presence, and so we build clocks that never tick, rooms that echo only with memory. Because silence is more bearable than forgetting," I said. He nodded, and for a time neither of us spoke. That evening the paper carried a small notice beneath the society columns. "Lady Seraphine Halloran has departed for an extended voyage, aboard the SS Orpheus, bound for Cairo. The former heiress of the Halloran estate has relinquished all remaining claims to the family fortune and resigned from the Royal Society of Engineers. She is not expected to return." I placed the newspaper down slowly. "She's seeking distance," I murmured. "Or closure," Holmes replied. "One must hope the desert is kind." As twilight settled over Baker Street, Holmes resumed his seat and struck a match to his pipe. Smoke rose lazily into the air, curling like the ghost of a thought unspoken. "Another case concluded," I said. "Hardly concluded," Holmes corrected. "Only abandoned at the point where reason may tread no further." And with that he closed his eyes and leaned back. I reached for my pen and notebook, already hearing the cadence of the tale forming in my head, the measured rhythm of facts, the peculiar scent of grief entwined with genius, the ticking that never came. And in that moment I realized something Holmes would never say aloud. Some mysteries are not solved. Some are only understood, and that, perhaps, is enough.